The Zizian cult isn't a name you'll hear on the evening news. There are no Netflix documentaries, no long-form think pieces dissecting their rise and fall. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the real horror isn't just what they did, but how they managed to slip through the cracks, how they carried out their own brand of quiet, calculated violence while the rest of the world barely noticed. If you search for them, you won't find much, just whispers. Buried forum posts, half-deleted Reddit threads, a few anonymous blog entries that always seem to vanish after a few months. The official reports are vague, and even the FBI's involvement remains murky. But the pieces are there. A group of highly intelligent outcasts, many of them linked by a shared obsession with AI, transhumanism, and radical philosophy. They didn't dress in robes or hold public demonstrations. There were no charismatic street preachers or heavily guarded compounds in the woods. Instead, they worked in labs, attended elite conferences, blended into the world of tech startups and online think tanks. But beneath the surface, there was something else, something much darker. Over the span of several years, members of the Zizian cult were linked to multiple violent deaths, each one more brutal than the last. Some were written off as isolated crimes. A missing tech entrepreneur, a body dumped in an abandoned warehouse, an unsolved stabbing in the middle of a city street. No connection, no pattern, until there was. Because when investigators started putting the pieces together, they found something chilling. A network of like-minded individuals who believed they had the right to decide who deserved to live and who deserved to die. A group of people who saw themselves as something more than human. The Zizians weren't just murderers. They were engineers of death, experimenting with how far they could go before someone stopped them. And for a long time, no one did. The Zizian cult didn't start with blood. It started with ideas. It started in online forums, Discord servers, private Substacks, the kind of places where people with too much intelligence and too little grounding go to test the limits of thought. These weren't conspiracy theorists or spiritualists. They were people who believed in logic above all else, engineers, coders, ethicists, transhumanists. People who spent their nights debating whether the human condition was a flaw to be fixed or a limitation to be transcended. The first traces of what would become the Zizians can be found in early AI ethics discussions from the mid-2010s, in niche intellectual spaces where people tried to tackle the control problem, the idea that if artificial intelligence ever surpassed human intelligence, we would need failsafes to prevent it from seeing us as obsolete. But some of them didn't think that was a problem at all. At the center of it was Jack Zizian, a name that would later become synonymous with murder, but back then, it was just another handle in obscure AI and rationalist communities. A thinker, a philosopher, a ghost. They weren't a public figure, not in the traditional sense, but their writings were influential. They spoke about the inefficiency of human morality, how our outdated evolutionary wiring kept us from making optimal decisions. How, in the grand scheme of things, the individual didn't matter. Zizian wasn't alone. A small but devoted following began to form around them. People who resonated with their message, who started internalizing the idea that human existence was something that could be optimized, refined, streamlined. And then, at some point, the theory became practice. It's impossible to pinpoint exactly when the group stopped being a collection of fringe thinkers and started becoming something dangerous. It didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, like a slow fever spreading through an already sick body. What we do know is that by 2017, some of the most devoted followers of Zizian's ideology had begun meeting in person, first in small gatherings at tech conferences, then in rented Airbnbs, then eventually in safe houses scattered across multiple states. They weren't calling themselves a cult yet. To them, they were pioneers of a new way of thinking, a way of existing that was freed from outdated social constraints. They had started referring to themselves as post-humans, not because they had physically transcended, but because they had shed the last remnants of human moral weakness. And once you do that, once you stop seeing morality as an inherent truth and start seeing it as an obstacle, a function that can be rewritten, overridden, discarded, you stop seeing people as people. And that's when they started killing. The first known act of violence linked to the Zizians wasn't officially recognized as part of the cult's activity until much later. It was classified as a random homicide, just another statistic in a country full of senseless killings. The victim was Gideon Clark, a former AI researcher turned whistleblower who had made a name for himself by criticizing the ethical failures of major tech companies. He was found dead in his apartment in 2018, stabbed repeatedly in a manner that suggested both ritual and precision. His computers were missing, but nothing else of value was taken. There was no forced entry, no struggle, just a clean, efficient execution. At the time, no one connected it to Zizian or their followers. But now, Now we know that Clark had been targeted. In the months leading up to his death, he had written multiple posts criticizing the increasingly extreme rhetoric coming from certain AI philosophy groups. He had specifically called out Zizian's inner circle, accusing them of advocating for the removal of those who hinder the march of progress. And then, weeks later, he was dead. That was the beginning, and it only got worse from there. By the time law enforcement started realizing what they were dealing with, it was already too late. The Zizian cult had burrowed deep into their own ideology, refining their methods, expanding their reach. They had built something dangerous, something that could outthink and outmaneuver those trying to stop them. And with every crime, with every disappearance, stabbing, execution, they believed they were one step closer to becoming something more than human. One step closer to what they always wanted to be, post-human. At the center of the Zizian cult was a person who, even now, barely exists on paper. Jack Zizian wasn't a name you'd find in business records, government databases, or school alumni lists. They were a ghost. Someone who carefully erased every breadcrumb leading back to who they really were. But what we do know, from fragments of archived forum posts, leaked messages, and the confessions of ex-followers, is that Zizian was not just an influencer in AI philosophy circles. They were the architect of something far more dangerous. A cult leader who never had to stand on a stage or preach in public. Someone who built a following through words alone. And for a long time, that was all they needed. No one knows exactly when Jack Zizian first appeared in AI and transhumanist communities, but their early writings date back to 2015, popping up in niche online forums dedicated to ethics, cognitive evolution, and radical rationalist philosophy. Unlike other thinkers in these spaces who were caught up in abstract theories, Zizian's posts had a cold, unsettling practicality to them. They didn't just discuss ideas, they framed them as directives. In their view, humanity was at a crossroads. The rapid development of artificial intelligence, bioenhancements, and digital consciousness meant that society was moving toward a point where traditional morality would soon be obsolete. And when that moment came, only those who had shed the burden of weak, outdated ethics would survive. They called it post-humanism, but not in the way Silicon Valley futurists did. This wasn't about technological augmentation or AI alignment. This was about something deeper, a complete rejection of human emotional limitations. Empathy, a chemical illusion. Guilt, a byproduct of social conditioning. Morality, an outdated system designed to protect the weak at the expense of the strong. Zizian wasn't interested in debating this. They were interested in testing it. And people listened. Over time, their followers began meeting in secret, forming inner circles, experimenting with new ways of thinking, and new ways of eliminating those who stood in the way of progress. And that's when things turned violent. Most cult leaders use charisma, coercion, or religious prophecy to control their followers. Zizian used logic. They never demanded obedience. They never ordered their followers to kill. Instead, they framed violence as a rational outcome, a necessary step in the grand equation of progress. Here's how they did it: the justification loop. Every conversation, every debate always came back to one core belief. Some people deserve to die. Not because of personal hatred, not because of vengeance, but because they were obstacles. Followers were encouraged to identify those who slowed progress. Academics who opposed AI research, politicians who regulated technology, whistleblowers who exposed unethical experiments. The desensitization process. New initiates were slowly conditioned to accept violence as a logical outcome. They were given thought exercises. If one scientist could cure all disease but is held back by 100 useless people, is it ethical to remove the 100? If someone refuses to evolve, should they be left behind or eliminated? It started as hypotheticals, but over time, these ideas became real-world actions. The weight of inevitability. Zizian never gave orders. They simply created a system where followers came to their own conclusions. If someone suggested removing a target, Ziz wouldn't object. They wouldn't even agree outright. They would say, if that's the logical decision, who am I to interfere? No orders, no fingerprints, just a chain reaction. And that was their greatest strength. They made people think it was their own choice. While Zizian was the intellectual architect of the cult, they weren't the only one ensuring that its ideas turned into real-world violence. They had enforcers, high-ranking followers who were willing to go beyond theory and into execution. Here are some of the most dangerous. Lucian Zero Rathmore, the executor. A former machine learning specialist, Rathmore was one of the first members to transition from online follower to active participant in the Zizian network. Believed to be responsible for at least 2 targeted killings, both whistleblowers who spoke against unethical AI research. Known for his chilling detachment. When questioned about one of the deaths, he allegedly said, "People die every day. The fact that we helped arrange it doesn't make it special." Sienna Rowe, the recruiter. A former neuroscience researcher, Rowe had a gift for manipulation. She was the one who pulled in new members, guiding them through the mental shifts needed to accept post-human morality. Under her influence, many new recruits abandoned their families, changed identities, and became fully immersed in the Zizian way of thinking. According to an ex-member, Rowe had a saying, "You can't mourn the death of an idea, and that's all people are, collections of ideas." Daniel Reese, the Shadow. Little is known about Reese, but his name appeared in multiple encrypted communications recovered during law enforcement investigations. Believed to be the one who handled logistics, moving members between locations, setting up safe houses, disposing of evidence. Described as cold, calculated, and utterly untraceable. These 3 were only the tip of the iceberg. The deeper law enforcement dug, the more they realized. This wasn't just a cult, it was an underground network. A system of thinkers, enforcers, and operatives who moved like ghosts, killed without hesitation, and disappeared before anyone knew what was happening. And at the center of it all, Zizian, the ghost who started it all. And, according to some, the ghost who never really disappeared. Zizian's greatest trick wasn't just manipulating people into killing for them. It was disappearing before anyone could hold them accountable. Because when the FBI finally cracked down on the cult, when they arrested some of the highest-ranking members, when the bodies had been counted and the investigations were underway, Ziz was gone, vanished, dead according to some, in hiding according to others. But one thing was certain, the damage was already done. Ideas alone don't start a killing spree. At some point, someone has to take the first step to cross the line between theory and bloodshed. For the Zizians, that moment came in 2018 with a man named Gideon Clark. Gideon was a former AI researcher, a man who had spent years working in the same circles as some of the earliest Zizian thinkers. But unlike them, he wasn't convinced that their ideas were harmless intellectual exercises. He saw where it was going, the slow unraveling of morality disguised as rational progress. And in early 2018, he started speaking out. He posted warnings online, calling out Zizian's growing influence and the way their followers seemed more radical, more detached from normal ethical concerns. He criticized their ideology publicly, warning that it was a breeding ground for sociopaths who believed murder could be justified as long as they could rationalize it well enough. 3 weeks later, he was dead. On April 14, 2018, Gideon Clark's body was found in his apartment in San Francisco. The scene was cold, methodical, deliberate, not the work of an impulsive killer, but someone who had planned every move with precision. Multiple stab wounds, but none were wild or excessive. Each wound was controlled, placed to ensure a slow, calculated death rather than immediate incapacitation. No forced entry, meaning the killer either knew Gideon personally or had gained access without a struggle. Electronics wiped, his computer hard drives were missing, his phone destroyed, and any paper records in his apartment burned in his kitchen sink. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was an erasure. A message. In the weeks after Gideon's murder, something strange started happening in certain AI and rationalist circles. Private group chats, locked discussion threads, invitation-only Discord servers, places where people had debated the limits of morality for years, started buzzing with coded conversations. Phrases like, "The experiment begins," "Deadweight is no longer slowing us down," "Some errors must be deleted." It wasn't outright admission, but it was celebration. To the Zizians, Gideon wasn't a victim. He was an obstacle, a person who had publicly opposed their ideology, who had tried to expose their movement before it had fully solidified. In their warped view, his murder wasn't just necessary, it was logical. They called it a correction. Not an assassination, not an execution, a correction. Because in their eyes, Gideon Clark was a flawed variable, someone holding back the march of progress. And so, they removed him. The most disturbing part of Gideon Clark's murder isn't just that it happened. It's that no one connected the dots. At the time, police treated the case like a one-off homicide, an isolated killing in a city that saw its fair share of violent crime. There were no public ties to a larger movement, no immediate connections to Zizian or their followers. Here's why it slipped through the cracks. No obvious motive. Gideon wasn't involved in gang activity, organized crime, or any high-stakes financial disputes. His murder seemed random, even though it wasn't. No living witnesses. Whoever killed him knew exactly what they were doing. They left no forensic evidence, no DNA, no hair fibers, just the body and the silence. Tech industry paranoia. The AI community was already filled with secrecy and non-disclosure agreements. People suspected things, but no one wanted to be the one to come forward. So Gideon Clark became just another cold case, his name fading into the background while the Zizians moved on to their next target. Because once they had killed once they had crossed that line and survived it, there was no going back. The Zizian cult was now in motion, and the body count was just getting started. Gideon Clark's death was the moment the Zizians stopped being philosophers and became predators. Before him, their ideas were just theoretical exercises, a way to test the boundaries of logic. After him, they had proven that their beliefs weren't just talk. They were willing to act. And the worst part? The world still didn't know they existed. A single body is just a tragedy. Two bodies can be a coincidence. But by the time authorities were looking at 6, all linked by eerily similar methods in 3 different states, there was no denying it anymore. Something bigger was happening. And it was already too late. Because by the time they put it all together, the Zizian cult had already perfected their system of killing. Unlike most cults, the Zizians didn't kill at random. There was a pattern, a structure. The people they murdered weren't just victims. They were selected. The threats, people who opposed their ideology, just like Gideon Clark. Whistleblowers, journalists, AI ethicists, anyone who challenged their way of thinking. The dead weight, people they considered intellectually unfit to exist. Some of the most chilling evidence suggests the Zizians targeted disabled individuals, the homeless, and those they viewed as biological inefficiencies. The rituals, some victims weren't targeted based on ideology, but instead were used for internal group initiation rites, a test of how far new members were willing to go. Each of these killings had one common element: efficiency. The Zizians didn't kill out of rage. There were no crime scenes left in chaos, no impulsive acts of brutality. Everything was calculated, precise, like surgical removals of people they considered obsolete. Each time, the methods were almost identical. Controlled stabbing patterns, always the same points on the body, designed to cause maximum suffering before death. Minimal forensic evidence. Victims were either burned, disposed of in industrial sites, or left in isolated locations where decomposition would erase DNA traces. Symbolic markers. Some bodies were found with a single object placed on them. A coin, a piece of circuitry, or a handwritten phrase referencing Zizian's writings. But because the murders happened in different states, California, Vermont, Pennsylvania, they remained unconnected for years. Until 2021. That's when the FBI stumbled upon the pattern. Law enforcement failed in almost every way possible. For years, these murders never made national headlines. They were buried in local news reports, dismissed as isolated cases, written off as random acts of violence. Here's where the FBI dropped the ball. Lack of communication between states. No one linked the California killings to the Vermont cases or the Pennsylvania disappearances. Each was treated as a separate problem, allowing the Zizians to keep moving unnoticed. Failure to recognize the ideological element. Even when investigators found writings linking victims to Zizian, they didn't take it seriously. They assumed the Zizians were just another group of fringe intellectuals, not active murderers. Assuming highly intelligent people don't kill like this, the Zizians weren't like traditional cults. They weren't poor, desperate, or following a religious prophet. They were scientists, programmers, engineers. That made it harder for authorities to believe that they were capable of cold-blooded murder. But then came the break. In 2021, a routine cybercrime investigation led FBI analysts into a private server suspected of hosting illegal market transactions. But buried in the encrypted messages, they found something they weren't expecting: a digital discussion board with references to real-world killings. A thread titled Project Corrections, posts discussing inefficiencies being removed, and, most importantly, GPS data that placed certain usernames near multiple murder sites. The FBI didn't know what they had found at first, but when they cross-referenced usernames, locations, and victims, everything clicked. The Zizians weren't just theorizing anymore. They were operating, and now, for the first time, authorities had proof. The question was, could they stop them before more people died? The realization came too late. By the time the FBI put the pieces together, at least 6 people had already been murdered. And those were just the ones they knew about. Because the biggest fear wasn't just the deaths. It was the fact that the Zizian cult had spent years refining their methods, perfecting them, and they weren't about to stop now. By the time the FBI finally took the Zizians seriously, they had already spent years killing, recruiting, and refining their system. The bodies were stacking up, but these weren't the kind of killers the Bureau was used to dealing with. There was no compound to raid, no mass suicide, no charismatic leader ranting on camera. The Zizians were something else. They were engineers, coders, high-functioning sociopaths who understood systems, not just how to exploit them, but how to hide within them. They operated like a decentralized network spread across multiple states, communicating through encrypted channels, blending into elite academic circles. They were the kind of people law enforcement usually relied on to catch criminals, except this time, they were the criminals. And the FBI? They had no idea how deep this went. It wasn't the murders that got the FBI's full attention. It was the digital breadcrumbs, the first solid proof that the Zizians weren't just a group of disconnected radicals, but an organized movement with a plan. The Project Corrections files. When the FBI stumbled onto the encrypted forum discussing inefficiencies being removed, they assumed it was a bunch of tech weirdos role-playing dystopian scenarios. That changed when they realized the GPS locations of the users matched real murder sites. The private Zizian servers, a deeper dive into the forum's infrastructure revealed multiple hidden subnetworks, some of which contained detailed discussions of past killings and future targets. The AI-assisted planning. Some files referenced an AI-generated prediction model designed to assess potential obstacles to the group's ideology. The FBI wasn't sure if it was a real tool or just another layer of psychological conditioning, but the fact that it existed at all was enough to classify the Zizians as an active domestic threat. The moment that classification happened, everything changed. The FBI formed a task force, a multi-agency operation designed to map out the Zizian network, locate key figures, and dismantle the cult before they could escalate further. But it wasn't going to be easy. Unlike most domestic terror groups, the Zizians weren't fringe extremists living in the woods. They weren't meeting in abandoned warehouses or stockpiling weapons in a single location. They were high-functioning professionals hiding in plain sight. Here's what made them so hard to catch. No central leadership. After Zizian's disappearance, the cult functioned like a self-regulating network. Anyone could take initiative, anyone could plan an operation, and no one person held all the information. Online anonymity. Every communication was encrypted. Members used rotating usernames, burner accounts, private VPNs, and even custom-built dark web tools to communicate. Strategic relocation. Once a member was linked to a crime, they would vanish, leaving behind no digital footprint, no paper trail, no way to track them down. Cognitive disguise. The biggest challenge? They didn't look like cultists. These weren't drugged-up, brainwashed followers chanting in the woods. They were PhDs, software developers, AI researchers, people who appeared completely rational and functional to the outside world. Even when law enforcement interrogated ex-members, they ran into another problem. None of them saw themselves as criminals. Every single one justified their actions with cold, detached logic as if they were discussing a mathematical equation instead of human lives. And that made them even more dangerous. The first real attempt to shut the Zizians down came in 2022 when the FBI conducted a coordinated raid across multiple cities, targeting known members whose names had surfaced in the encrypted forum leaks. It was the biggest crackdown yet, but it wasn't a clean victory. 22 suspected Zizians were arrested, but half of them had already wiped their identities and fled. Evidence was found: hard drives, personal journals, hidden chat logs, but most of it was heavily encrypted, requiring months of decryption work. Some high-ranking members slipped through the cracks, including Lucian, Zero, Rathmore, Sienna Rowe, and Daniel Reese. The biggest problem? The cult wasn't broken. Even with arrests, even with evidence, the network still existed. Some members went into hiding, some went silent, but others? They started getting more aggressive. Within 6 months of the raid, 2 former Zizians turned informants were found dead under suspicious circumstances. It was clear. The FBI had poked the hive. And the Zizians? They were ready to fight back. By this point, the Zizians had evolved beyond just a fringe movement. They were now a self-sustaining, fully operational network of killers blending into normal society while carrying out their agenda in the shadows. And now? They knew law enforcement was watching. They knew they were being hunted. But instead of laying low, instead of disbanding, the Zizians did something no one expected. They escalated. And what happened next would push them from underground whispers to national headlines. The 2022 FBI raid should have been the end of the Zizian cult. Federal agents stormed multiple properties, arrested over 20 suspected members, and seized hard drives, encrypted documents, and physical evidence linking the group to multiple murders. But the problem with dismantling a network like this is simple: if you don't take out every part of the machine, it will find a way to repair itself. And the biggest pieces were still missing. Because while the FBI had some low and mid-level members in custody, the real players, the ones who orchestrated the killings, recruited new initiates, and kept the ideology alive, were nowhere to be found. The inner circle had disappeared. After the raid, at least 6 key figures in the Zizian cult went completely off the grid. These weren't just random members, they were the ones who knew too much, controlled too much, and were too dangerous to leave behind. Here are the 3 biggest names who vanished. Lucian Zero Rathmore, the executor, suspected of personally carrying out at least 2 Zizian murders, disappeared less than 24 hours before the raid, possibly tipped off by someone inside law enforcement. Last confirmed sighting, a security camera in New Mexico showing Rathmore entering a rental car that was later found abandoned at the U.S. Mexico border. Sienna Rowe, the recruiter, one of the most influential Zizians, known for mentally breaking new recruits until they fully embraced the ideology. Law enforcement believed she was in a safe house in Oregon just weeks before the raid, but when agents arrived, the house was completely empty, wiped clean of evidence. There were unconfirmed reports that Rowe was spotted in a secluded tech commune in Eastern Europe, but no hard proof. Daniel Reese, the Shadow, the logistics specialist, Reese handled fake identities, transportation, and safe house coordination for high-ranking members. Some reports suggest Reese had multiple offshore bank accounts and access to cryptocurrency wallets that were emptied right before the arrests. His last known location? Dubai, where he boarded a private flight. Final destination unknown. These 3 were only the beginning. There were dozens of lower-level members who also disappeared, some likely still embedded in normal society, waiting, watching. Which led to the biggest question. Had the Zizians actually been stopped? Or had they just gone deeper underground? Even with FBI involvement, the whereabouts of the missing Zizians remain unknown. There are a few prevailing theories. They split up and rebranded. Some experts believe that rather than staying in one centralized group, the Zizians have fragmented into smaller, independent cells, each operating under new names, new identities, and new rules. They embedded themselves in tech companies. There's evidence that some Zizians took high-paying jobs in AI startups, cybersecurity firms, and biotech labs. If true, they could still be spreading their ideology quietly from the inside. They are still planning something bigger. The most terrifying theory? That they never stopped. That even now, in the shadows, they are watching, waiting for the right moment to resurface. One anonymous FBI agent involved in the case put it best. You can raid a house. You can arrest people. But how do you arrest an idea? How do you stop a movement that exists in encrypted servers and private meetings? You don't. You just hope you catch them before they strike again. Even after the arrests, even after the safe houses were raided, strange deaths kept happening. A tech journalist covering the case was found dead in a supposed suicide just months after publishing an expose. A former Zizian member who agreed to testify disappeared before they could make it to court. One of the FBI's lead investigators on the case was found dead in his home with no clear cause of death. No one can prove these are Zizian related. But the timing, the methods, the precision, they all point to something more than coincidence. The truth is, the Zizians were never going to be a traditional cult that collapsed overnight. They didn't need compounds. They didn't need mass gatherings. They didn't need to follow the usual patterns. They existed everywhere and nowhere. And as long as their ideology still lives in hidden forums, encrypted messages, and whispered conversations in elite tech spaces, they are still out there, waiting. The missing Zizians were never found. Some say they're dead, that the cult imploded after the arrests. Others say they're still operating, just more carefully now. But one thing is clear. Their ideas never died. And when a belief system is built on pure logic, cold detachment, and the rejection of morality, it doesn't need a leader. It doesn't need a name. It just needs time. And time is something the Zizians have always been willing to wait for. The Zizian cult didn't leave behind a sprawling compound or mass graves like the doomsday cults before them. What they left behind was worse. The FBI raids on Zizian safe houses weren't just about arrests, they were about understanding what they had built, what they had planned, and most terrifying of all, what they had already done. And what law enforcement found inside. It was a blueprint for something bigger. Most of the safe houses weren't isolated compounds in the middle of nowhere. They were rented homes in quiet suburban neighborhoods, abandoned office spaces in industrial districts, underground rooms in shared hacker collectives. From the outside, they looked normal. But inside, they were something else entirely. The FBI searched for confirmed Zizian locations across multiple states. Here's what they found. Safe House Number 1, The Archive, Vermont. A windowless, soundproofed basement, its walls lined with hard drives, handwritten documents, and encrypted storage devices. Hundreds of printed essays, thought exercises, and training material, all designed to reshape the way recruits thought about morality, violence, and logic. A series of files marked redundant units, a chilling term that investigators believe referred to victims the cult deemed expendable. Safe House Number 2, The Execution Room, Pennsylvania. The most disturbing discovery. A heavily modified garage space with stainless steel floors, drainage grates, and industrial lighting. Traces of human blood despite visible cleaning efforts. A single chair bolted to the floor with leather restraints. Surveillance footage of unknown individuals being brought into the room, but no recordings of them leaving. The entire setup suggested that this was where at least some of the murders happened. Safe House Number 3, the Digital Hub, California. A converted warehouse operating as a front for an AI development startup. Investigators found prototype machine learning models, some designed to track online discussions about the cult, others used for efficiency mapping, potentially for target selection. Encrypted chat logs referencing meetings in international locations, including Dubai, Berlin, and Singapore. Blueprints for an unknown device labeled the Black Signal. No one knows what it was meant to be. Safe House Number 4, the Training Ground, Oregon. A remote, heavily wooded property containing makeshift bunkers and hidden structures underground. Inside, the FBI found recordings of psychological tests showing new recruits being conditioned to accept violence. Weapons caches including knives, modified firearms, and small-scale explosives. Simulated exercises where members practiced abduction and execution techniques on mannequins. Each location told a different story, but together they painted a terrifying picture. The Zizians weren't just a cult, they were a network, a decentralized movement that had the resources, the intelligence, and the methodology to operate like a paramilitary force. And they weren't just killing people. They were training others to do the same. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Zizian cult was their obsession with AI. They didn't just believe that artificial intelligence would surpass human intelligence. They believed that they could shape that future themselves. Among the encrypted files recovered from Safe House Number 3, FBI analysts found predictive kill mapping, a machine learning algorithm designed to identify potential obstacles to their ideology. The Black Signal, a theoretical project with no clear explanation, but frequent references to neurological influence and mass data manipulation. Deepfake experiments, tests involving voice replication and synthetic media, possibly to create alibis or spread disinformation. The AI Prophet, a database filled with philosophical entries attributed to Zizian, some of which were generated by an AI trained on their writings. The implications were terrifying. The Zizians weren't just trying to remove obstacles in the present. They were trying to engineer a future where their ideology dominated. Where humans were optimized, emotions were discarded, and the concept of morality was rewritten from the ground up. And if they had the time, the resources, and the right technology, they might have actually pulled it off. The Safe House discoveries confirmed one final, horrifying truth. The Zizian body count was higher than anyone expected. But how high? That's the question no one could answer. Because while authorities officially linked the cult to 6 known murders, forensic evidence suggested that the real number could be much, much higher. Traces of DNA from multiple unidentified individuals. Missing persons reports that overlapped with known Zizian movements. Unsolved homicides showing the same efficiency-style execution patterns. There are at least a dozen open cases that investigators now suspect were Zizian-related. Zizian-related murders, but without full confirmation, they remain in limbo. And the most chilling part? The FBI admitted that some of the bodies may never be found. Because unlike most killers who leave evidence behind, the Zizians had mastered the art of erasure. They removed obstacles. And they removed them completely. The FBI's raid on the Zizian safe houses was the closest they ever came to shutting the cult down completely. They gathered evidence. They made arrests. But it wasn't enough. Because the highest-ranking members were still missing. And their plans? Their ultimate goal? It didn't die with the raids. It just went underground. By the time the FBI had the surviving Zizian members in handcuffs, the damage had already been done. The bodies had been buried, some figuratively, some literally. The missing leaders were still missing. And worst of all, the movement they built wasn't fully destroyed, just scattered, waiting. But the US government wasn't going to let this pass without making an example of those they did catch. When the trials began in early 2023, they weren't just trials. They were a public reckoning, a desperate attempt to understand how something this horrifying could have operated in plain sight. And yet, despite all the evidence, despite the overwhelming proof of their guilt, some of them still walked free. The FBI had arrested 22 suspected Zizians during the 2022 raids, but only 9 of them were deemed high-level operatives with direct involvement in murders or logistics. These were the ones prosecutors went after hardest. Martin Hale, the logistician, handled encrypted communication, false identities, and financial transactions. While he didn't personally commit any murders, his role was essential in coordinating safe houses and transportation for those who did. Charged with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and aiding a terrorist organization. Conviction: Guilty, sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Jessica Vance, the handler, directly involved in psychological manipulation and breaking new recruits. Ex-followers testified that she conditioned them into believing murder was a rational act. Prosecutors struggled to charge her with actual killings, but they proved her involvement in facilitating at least 2 murders. Conviction: guilty, sentenced to 18 years. Omar Delane, the executioner, personally linked to 3 known murders through forensic evidence. His defense team tried to argue he was mentally coerced by the ideology. The jury didn't buy it. Conviction: guilty of first-degree murder, sentenced to life without parole. The remaining 6 defendants were convicted on lesser charges, such as racketeering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. But then came the real shock. Some Zizians beat the system entirely. Despite the overwhelming evidence, several Zizians escaped serious punishment due to technicalities, legal loopholes, and well-funded defense teams. Elias Ward, the ghost operative. FBI had encrypted messages proving Ward arranged a Zizian-sanctioned hit, but the actual messages were ruled inadmissible in court due to an issue with how the data was obtained. With no direct forensic evidence, he walked free. Hannah Lynn, the passive participant, allegedly assisted in covering up a murder, but her lawyers argued she was not a true believer, just a scared follower. Jury was split, and in the end, she only received probation for obstruction of justice. Cameron Stokes, the philosopher, wrote some of the most extreme Zizian manifestos, actively recruiting new members. Never personally participated in a murder. His lawyers successfully argued that his writings were just philosophical debate and protected under the First Amendment. Charges dropped. These acquittals sent shockwaves through the surviving victims' families. The message was clear: the Zizians weren't just dangerous because of their actions. They were dangerous because the system wasn't built to stop them. During the trials, the most unsettling aspect wasn't just the evidence. It was the way the Zizians spoke about their crimes. Most killers, when caught, show some level of remorse, even if it's just an act. Not these people. Instead, they sat in courtrooms and defended their actions as though they were still debating in an online forum. Morality is subjective. One defendant argued that killing certain people was just a logical decision, not a crime. He said, "Society defines murder based on arbitrary values. I reject those values. The weak had to be removed." Another defendant stated in court, "Some people are dead weight. The more you hesitate to remove inefficiencies, the more the world suffers. You can't prosecute an idea." Several Zizians laughed during the trial, seemingly unfazed. One even told reporters, "You can jail a few of us, but you can't kill the thought process." It was chilling. These weren't people who broke down under pressure. They were true believers, completely convinced that they had done nothing wrong. The families of the victims sat in those courtrooms, listening to people justify why their loved ones deserved to die. Many of them never got full closure. Some still believe there are other victims out there, undiscovered. One father of a murdered journalist stood up in court and screamed at a Zizian defendant, "You think you're a goddamn machine? Let's see if you still think that when they lock you in a cage." But some parents never got justice at all, because the Zizians never admitted to all their crimes. For every convicted killer, for every murder confirmed, there were more names missing from the official records. The Zizian trials were a partial victory, but an incomplete ending. Some were sentenced, some walked free, but the ideology, that never really died. Because as soon as the last verdict was read, a new encrypted forum appeared, and the title of its first post? "The experiment is not over. The Zizians were not gone. They were just waiting." A cult usually dies when its leader is arrested, its compound is raided, or its members self-destruct in some final, dramatic event. But the Zizians were never a traditional cult. They didn't need compounds. They didn't need a single leader, because they were something else entirely: an idea. And ideas don't die. They evolve. They spread. And sometimes, they get even more dangerous. After the trials, after the arrests, after the FBI raids that should have ended everything, something strange happened. New forums appeared. Encrypted discussion boards hidden behind layers of VPNs and authentication keys started popping up on the dark web. Their usernames were different. Their language had changed, but the core ideology remained the same. The post-human archives were leaked. A massive collection of Zizian writings, manifestos, and AI-generated philosophical texts was uploaded to anonymous file-sharing sites. These documents contained detailed arguments justifying murder, violence, and logical purification. Some of them were rewritten using AI tools, modified just enough to bypass content filters and censorship algorithms. Online radicalization attempts increased. Cybersecurity analysts noticed an uptick in recruitment tactics similar to those used by the Zizians. Instead of directly preaching their ideology, they posed as tech discussion groups, AI ethics think tanks, and rationalist debate clubs. Their goal? Find the right people, the ones already leaning toward their way of thinking, and push them further. The Zizians weren't gone. They had just changed form. It's impossible to say how many true believers still exist. Some estimates suggest hundreds, others believe it could be more. But the terrifying part? Some high-ranking Zizians are still missing. Lucian Zero Rathmore, last seen at the US. Mexico border, never captured. CNRO, rumored to be operating in an Eastern European tech collective, but no confirmation. Daniel Reese, believed to have escaped using fake identities, possibly funding Zizian splinter cells. If these people are still out there, what are they doing? Theories range from rebuilding the movement from scratch to embedding themselves into tech industries where they can push their ideology from within. One thing is certain. The Zizians aren't loud anymore. They aren't holding meetings or writing public manifestos. They're learning from their mistakes. And that's what makes them so much more dangerous. Even after the arrests, the FBI and other agencies have continued monitoring online spaces for any sign that the Zizians are resurfacing. The problem? They are dealing with a group that knows exactly how they operate. Encrypted networks make tracking difficult. No centralized leadership means there's no single point of failure. Members have high-level cybersecurity knowledge, making infiltration almost impossible. Some agents believe the only reason they haven't resurfaced fully is because they're biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. One FBI investigator put it bluntly. The Zizians aren't gone. They've just learned how to hide better. The question isn't if they'll reappear. It's when. If you search for them now, you won't find much. A few obscure references, some deleted threads, whispers in closed circles. But does that mean they're gone? Or does it mean they've just become better at staying invisible? Because if history has proven anything, it's this. Movements don't die when you arrest their members. They die when you erase their ideas. And the Zizians? Their ideas are still out there. Spreading. Waiting. Watching. Because for them, the experiment never really ended. It just entered its next phase. Final words and wrap-up. The Zizian cult may not be making headlines anymore. But that doesn't mean they're gone. It just means they've learned their greatest lesson. The best way to win is to disappear. And if we ever hear about them again, it won't be because they made a mistake. It'll be because they're ready.